Hello and welcome back to Ancient Wales. And this week is episode 7, and it is the tribes of Iron Age Britain. In the past few months, we've spent a great deal of time going over the aspects of culture, art, protection, and daily life during the 800 years of the Iron Age in Britain. Today, we're going to cover a path we've trodden before, one of a purely Welsh perspective to a broader and more British perspective. And today, what we're going to do is talk about the tribes of Britain as we know them, pretty much from the time of the initial invasion and eventual overall domination of the land that comes during the time of the early time of Caesar in the middle of the first century BC into the time of the full scale taking over of the landscape that happens during the middle of the first century AD. And what does that mean for Britain? How does it change things? And all of that comes about. But what we're going to focus on is originally a discussion of the tribes, some examples of evidence that we have about some of the ways that tribes are led, and a discussion about more traditional things like trade, marriage, and other things like that. So let's get started, shall we? The reason we often refer to them as tribes rather than, say, a kingdom or a state is that at this point there were no formal versions of states or kingdoms or borders for that mean. And there wasn't really anything like feudal loyalty to a king or to some lord. So there isn't even a mild understanding of what we would consider to be a nation state today. There wasn't even really city states that we can identify. It just wasn't something we saw. These weren't kingdoms in the modern sense, but kin-based societies led by chieftains or warrior elites as examples. It's important to remember that we're not even sure the names of these tribes. They are given names by the Romans, and these names could be made up or they could be mangled versions of the actual name, like the name Britain, which comes to us via the Greeks, who called the island of the Painted Ones, which is then mangled by Latin writers later into Britannia rather than, or Painted Ones being mangled into whatever form British means in Latin. And all of this kind of comes about because of a misunderstanding. So you can understand how this happens. Look at the way Welsh villages and towns become known under names that don't make any sense in the modern standpoint or are obvious transliterations of the names in Welsh, like Ceredigion becomes Cardigan, Cardiff becomes Cardiff. You have that kind of thing going on rather than wholesale changing of like Abertawe to Swansea. You don't have that necessarily that we know of, but that also could be happening. We really don't have a good understanding of it. And because the interpretation by writers at a later date, and even amongst the Britons themselves, will convert to the Roman writing, so we don't really know. And that's what we have to keep up with is all through the discussions about these people, we will not know for sure, but we can make educated guesses based on the sounding of the names. Do they sound more like a possible Iron Age British name than, say, a obvious Celtic name that's been translated here? And those are the kind of things we have to kind of work with to understand. So as long as we're all clear that this is vague, I think we're okay and we can make our way through it. Archaeologically, tribes can be traced through their settlement patterns, pottery styles, burial practices, and eventually through coinage. The Catulevani, for example, had centers in what is now known as Herefordshire, and they themselves minted their own coins as an early sign of political organization. Southward, the Artabetes, possibly an offshoot of a continental tribe, although again, we don't know. There's a Belgae tribe here, which we don't know if they're anything to do with the Belgae in what is now Belgium, or if they're just conveniently named similar. And In the case of the Artabetes, they controlled parts of modern Hampshire and Berkshire and had trading links with Gaul. So they did carry similarities because of that. In the west, the Durotriges lived in present day Dorset and were amongst the most fiercest people to resist Romanization. Their hill forts at Maiden Castle stand as one of Europe's largest and most impressive Iron Age sites. Even to this day, we still find evidence around the Iron Age settlement as well as the later medieval settlements and the Roman settlements. Further north, the Brigantes ruled much of what we now consider to be northern England. They were the largest tribe and had a complicated dealings with the Roman Empire, sometimes allying, sometimes resisting. And of course, a fairly famous one is the Iceni of East Anglia, who are remembered best for one of their iconic and defiant leaders, Boudica, who we have discussed in past episodes and will definitely discuss further down the road. Tribal life in Iron Age Britain was deeply rooted in family ties, clan networks, local alliances. All of these weren't homogenous nations, but confederations of related groups who often came together under powerful chieftains or what might be considered kings. They could also be elders or under shamans, if you want to call them that, or like religious leadership, or even just a wise one who happens to be kind of magical in their perceptions. All of these things could be what they're led by. We've mentioned this before, so this is nothing new. At the heart of each tribe was an extended family or kin group, and these families formed the building blocks of society. And of course, because of that, they shared the land, the labor, and responsibility. And as they grew, so too did the size of their tribe, and each tribe would grow out of that. Loyalty to one's kin, of course, was paramount, and disputes could erupt into feuds if honor was at stake in these rivalries. Above the family unit was a hierarchical structure. And we're going to assume here, because we don't fully know, this is the interpretation of people like Caesar, who are telling us what he sees, but his interpretation of what he's seeing may be converted from his Roman understanding and trying to place it upon people who don't have a Roman understanding. So keep that in mind. But we assume that they would have warrior elites. They would have nobles, likely made up of elders or wise men or women, who held land and influence and often showcased through wealth, through ornate torques, decorated weaponry, and imported goods and large feasting halls, their status. And it was performative, obviously, because it was to impress others, be they foreigners, be they other tribes, to show how dominant you were through the wealth you had. Power, of course, is always performative, and it was shown, shared, and sometimes seized because of that. Chieftains or kings acted as political leaders, war captains, and religious figures. Their power wasn't absolute, and it relied on maintaining alliances with other elites, rewarding loyalty, and showing strength in battle and negotiations. Power could be inherited, but it could also be challenged. Some tribes likely had councils of elders or advisors, and others may have been more autocratic, especially at times of war, which we know in this age, warfare was fairly dominant to a lot of what was going on. Were there peaceful areas? Sure, but you also had to protect your territory from others, as especially the populations started to explode. Local politics, of course, were complex. Tribes could be at war with one another, or they might intermarry, trade, or forge temporary alliances with one another based on different situations and circumstances. Borders, because of this, were fluid, shifting with marriages and skirmishes and treaties, and it's even possible that some smaller tribes were vassals of larger ones. However, it is a bit dangerous to assume too much because, of course, while it makes sense in these cases, it doesn't necessarily mean it was exactly the same as what we see elsewhere. We're making assumptions on a culture that we don't have any contact with in a written form other than through others. And so we have only interpretations that can be made based on interpretations in the archaeology and, importantly, in what we see in other people in similar circumstances and what was written down about them. That's how we come to these conclusions. When I mean we, obviously, it's a very, very not me. But archaeologists and historians, that's how they interpret and come to understand things to work. And I don't think it's far wrong. This political dynamism began to be even more evident in later periods where tribes like the Catalaveni began to expand aggressively. They would absorb neighbors and issue coins that mimicked Roman styles, a sign that they understood power on both sides of the channel and showed their ability to be the dominant force in the area. One aspect of ancient Britain that appears to be the case, at least for some tribes, was an important role played by women. Women appeared to have passed on land and wealth to daughters and not sons as communities were built around women's bloodlines. Matriarchal societies were not uncommon in Britain. We don't think they're the majority, but they certainly existed and there's certain evidence of it. For example, scientists have found evidence of a whole community built around a female line of a family of over a generations, probably originating around one woman, one very powerful woman, obviously. From the BBC story around the discovery of this, let me quote, "This points to an Iron Age society in Britain where women wielded quite a lot of influence and could shape its trajectory in many ways," said Dr. Laura Cassidy at Trinity Dublin, lead author of the research, end quote. Dr. Cassidy would then take this DNA and sequence it from the bones of 57 different individuals from the Durotriges tribe that were founded around Dorset in between 100 BC and 180. Because of this research, it was found that women in the community were related by blood, dating back generations. On the other hand, there was much more diversity around the Y chromosome, which was passed, of course, from father to son, indicating that men from a lot of different locations were then moving into the community through marriage and other reasonings. Some believe that the reason why this is happening, or at least in this case, could have been because men who had been fighting wars and were not as involved in the day-to-day politics of the tribe. And slowly over time, the women became more powerful, had more reason to be perceived as powerful. And then through the generations, it becomes just natural, right? And much like how, if you think about it this way, think about if you're looking at the way someone becomes in charge of things, right? So if we look at like what we conceive to be happening in the post-Roman period, where you have small administrators of territory or people who just happen to control a lot of land because they had a big family, start to become more and more important in society. Maybe they're the owners of a safe haven. They have a hill fort and they, try and gain more territory so that they can have a bigger family through marriage, through other adjustments. And slowly over time, they grow to be the natural leader of the tribe because they've just basically been that way. And then they kind of pass it down to their next descendant, who passes it down to their next descendant, who passes it down, so on and so on, as we kind of see. Well, this would be no different in a female situation. You have maybe it's a circumstance where most of the men were wiped out and the ones who are left are mostly the female leadership. And so they bring in male members from outside of the tribe to come marry in. But instead of turning over control to the new male inhabitants, because they are new, the women continue to hold charge over everything that's going on. And so it then just naturally becomes that way. Or it could be, and this just, hear me out. It could be that was always the way it was. Maybe this particular tribe had always worked on the idea that the matrilineal linkages were more important. Maybe they put more primacy on the fact that a woman could give birth as being more attached to deity. We don't know. So these are just guesses based on some educated studies of other people and other things and what we see happening in the archaeological record. But just to kind of give you a concept that there's a number of ways this could have come about, and there's no right nor wrong answer, but we do know that this is likely the case in this particular tribe. And just because it happened with this particular tribe doesn't mean it happened across Britain. Obviously, there are different levels of control that are accessed and used by women in different tribes. But it is important to note that it wasn't uncommon, and it was so not uncommon that the Romans looked at that as part of the reason why the British were backward, because they had women who were in charge at any point, which they definitely didn't agree with in the Roman cultural standpoint, which was heavily dominated by the father figure or the patronymic lifestyle that they lived under, where the pater or the father of the household had all the control. So you come to a place where that's totally the opposite, and suddenly you see it as being barbaric or backward. So that's one of the things we have to look at. It's an interesting side effect of maybe a bunch of different things, but it is a neat sort of interlude into what's going on there. Because these ancient Britons obviously left behind no written language, archaeology becomes our translator. Across the countryside, roundhouses appear in settlements. Wooden and thatched structures, clustered in family groups, become the basis for villages, for townships, and more. Burial practices, of course, vary across the landscape. Cremation in urns in some places, inhumation in graves in other places, some with no grave goods, others with all sorts of grave goods, and even more different ideas about how you do these things. And each speaks to the cultural depth and identity of changing belief systems in different areas and different times. Hill forts, of course, are, as we mentioned previously, a striking remnant of both defensive, symbolic, and communal strength. And because of this, they are seen inherently to be linked to the tribes and what they're doing. And often, of course, we find tools, weapons, bones, jewelry, and evidence of feasting and warfare being carried out on these hilltop locations. And of course, along with that, as time goes on, there becomes coins. Some tribes began minting their own coins around 2nd century BCE, which is marked with stylized horses, gods, and symbols. These may or may not have been used as traditional currency, but could be as gifts, rewards, or other prizes as a matter of propaganda, something that was done in other parts of the world. We assume when we see coins that they're always money, but they aren't always money. Sometimes they're just symbol and symbolic, a bit more like, think of them more like the Olympic medal. You know, yes, it has value. Yes, there is gold, silver, or bronze, depending on which one you win, but it's not money. You can't take it to the bank and use it to buy things. That's not how the world worked. And in a world where bartering was more common, these metal things that people are getting wouldn't necessarily be worth what we perceive them to be worth now. But what they are is a way of saying, here's our power and our prestige, that we can do this, that we have the time and the skill and the ability to do this. And oh, by the way, it also points out the idea that we are here. Look at us. And of course, coinage lasts longer. So it even shows some continuity over the ages. So that's another thing to keep in mind with all of that. So with all of that in mind, let's have a look at some of the tribes. We know that there are over 20 tribes that occupy different regions of Britain around the time of the Romans. Thanks to Roman records, inscriptions, and archaeological finds, there were probably hundreds, but we don't know that. We only know the ones that we have evidence of. So let's start initially from the Catavellani, who were based in southeast England. They were powerful and dominant just before the Roman invasion, or at least that's what the Romans give us. They're known for their coinage and their powerful rulers like Cassalavenes, who we will talk about in depth later. There's the Trinovantes, the neighbors and sometimes rivals of that tribe, based in modern Essex. They were in early contact with the Romans and the Gauls, and even allied with Julius Caesar during his invasion. The Iceni, of course, we mentioned previously, occupied East Anglia and were most famous for Queen Boudicca's revolt against the Romans in CE 60, known for their distinctive coinage and complex relationships with Rome, as we mentioned. The Belgae, who I mentioned, is another southern tribe with ties to Gaul, we believe. Their exact territorial reach, of course, has been debated by experts, and they appear to have settled in parts of Wiltshire and Hampshire. The Durotriges, who were mentioned previously, inhabited Dorset and parts of Somerset. They were known for resisting Romanization and had richly furnished burials and hill forts that we mentioned earlier. The Artabetes were a southern tribe linked to the continental counterparts in Gaul, and their leaders issued coins, maintained trade across the channel as well. Something you'd understand would be the case when you're talking about tribes that are facing into the English Channel, who are not very far away by boat from their fellow Gaulish Celtic counterparts, if you want to call them that. The Dobunni, based in the Severn Valley, were more peaceful with their interactions with Rome, and they left a rich legacy of coinage as well. You can see that most of the Southeast English tribes are involved in coin making. Again, because of their connections to the continent, it was probably influencing what they were doing and how they were showing off their own stylistic natures. The Brigantes were the largest tribe, occupying most of northern England, initially cooperative with Rome and under Queen Cartimanda, but later rebelled under her ex-husband, Ventilus. The Cornovae are a western tribe centered around what is now Shropshire. They had small hill forts and left behind less evidence of elite control, but they played a steady role throughout Iron Age life. And two, we are very, very familiar with the Ordovies and the Silures, which of course were the two major tribes in Wales who obviously resisted Roman rule. Tacitus described them as some of Rome's most determined opponents. The Caledoni and the Votadini in modern-day southern parts of Scotland. These tribes existed outside of Roman control and were known for limited Roman references in later medieval sources. They also famously, especially the Votadini, were mythologically supposed to be settlers in northern Wales at one point. That's speculative, and we don't know that that's true. But the idea of where some of the history of the Old North, as southern part of Scotland got to be called, comes from, or is believed to have come from them, although again, we don't know that to be true. These names, of course, were Latinized by Roman writers to give us a framework to understand the tribal geography of Iron Age Britain. Their identities were rooted in land and lineage and shared cultural traditions, and each tribe had its own response to the challenges of the Iron Age and especially later the Romans. Of course, intertribal politics in Iron Age Britain was anything but simple. Ireland was a mosaic of shifting loyalties, fierce rivalries, and strategic alliances. Tribes negotiated with one another constantly, and sometimes through warfare and other times through marriage, trade, or mutual defense, as we've mentioned frequently. Alliances, of course, could be forged through marriage of elite families, which would then create the bonds that crossed tribal boundaries. They were not only personal unions, but diplomatic ones, tying tribes together through shared blood and obligation. Because you're related to me now, hey, you got to come help me when I'm in trouble. This will carry on through the medieval period, in fact, as well. But diplomacy could quickly give way to rivalry. The rise of the Catalaveni offers a clear example of this. They were one of the most fierce expansionist tribes, steadily absorbing their neighbors and projecting influence through warfare and coinage. Their rivals, including the Trinoventes, once a dominant force in southeast Britain, so much so that Caesar even recorded that the Trinoventes sought Roman protection against the Catalaveni under the warlord Cassivellaunus. Further north, the Brigantes appear to have operated more like a tribal federation, perhaps balancing power internally through alliances and between subgroups. Tacitus later described how their queen Cartimandua made a controversial alliance with Rome while her ex-husband Venentius led a rebellion, illustrating that factionalization could exist even within one singular tribe. Tribes also competed for control of trade routes, fertile land, sacred sites, and other related issues. Conflicts might be settled through raiding, ransom, or a show of strength. And sometimes, as Caesar discovered, multiple tribes could put aside their rivalries and at least temporarily unite against a greater threat. Obviously, this will continue to happen for the Romans for a while. And keep in mind when we mention these tribes that that we've covered so far, none of these include tribes from northern parts of Scotland because the Romans didn't have a lot of contact with them. We're normally labeled the Picts, but even that's a little bit spurious because we don't really know fully if that was the complete complexity of the Highlands and that area of Scotland. But at least for southern Scotland and down, we have an understanding of at least names. Of course, among all this, trade was the lifeblood of Iron Age society. Tribes exchanged goods across Britain with the European continent as well. Items like salt, grain, cattle, metals, textiles, and pottery moved along established routes, sometimes overland, sometimes along rivers and coasts. In return, luxury goods flowed in, such as glass beads from the continent, wine amphorae from the Mediterranean, and even exotic items like coral and ivory. And of course, we pointed out in the past, this is also where iron, and before it, bronze came from. Hill forts and tribal centers often sat near trade routes, acting as hubs for both commerce and control. Control over trade meant influence, and of course, this often made certain tribes like the Arabetes and the Catalaveni wealthier and, because of this, more powerful. Coinage, introduced by continental tribes and adopted in Britain around the 2nd century BCE, reflect the web of trade. Each tribe's coins have distinct symbols, some imitating Roman or Gaulish styles, marking both identity and economic clout. However, some are completely different in the way that their look. They contain much more Celtic design influences, so you don't necessarily have a straight up one-to-one comparison, so keep that in mind. It all depended on the area and on the tribe and what they wanted. Of course, as we've talked about with whatever form marriage took in this period, it was mostly about diplomacy from what we can see, and about alliances and sealed peace deals and securing access to land, wealth, or status. A daughter might be married off to a rival son to ensure good behavior or at least temporary peace, and these unions helped to knit together complex intertribal networks. Women often served as cultural bridges, bringing new customs, languages, and loyalties to their new homes. Conversely, as we've just seen, you could then switch that around to men being married into these important tribes to try and bring these same sorts of things. So it can cut both ways, unlike a lot of other places on the continent and in especially the Mediterranean and the Near East. Such alliances could be long-lasting, but they might also unravel with political shifts or personal betrayals, sometimes directly leading to warfare. And keep in mind, much like in the medieval period when women were married to various places and then immediately those two places turned around and fought anyway, because it wasn't about the exchange. It was more about, well, we'll set peace for now, but so just because, the daughter of the local king was married into the other king's family didn't always mean a whole lot. It did, but it didn't always. Of course, as we've mentioned, not all these interactions were peaceful. We've mentioned previously in the past about how warfare worked for society and how there was a class of warrior class who basically controlled a level of power. And so they would be counted on to help force their way into other territory, to take prizes, or in other words, gather pillage from other tribes to, help theirs. This may have happened because of times of stress over population, or they may have happened over a desire for new land, or in some cases, probably religious reasons. There's lots of reasons why wars start and why they're fought, and some can be more symbolic than actual what we consider to be warfare in the modern sense. But no matter what, victorious leaders earned prestige, and it, of course, enforced their right to rule and could be shown as divine favor. However, defeat, of course, could mean anything from a loss of territory, honor, or even your independence from the other tribe. Archaeological sites like Danbury, South Cadbury, and Maiden Castles show signs of violent conflict burned fort gates, mass burials, defensive earthquakes. These were not just homes, as we've said, they could be and were used as strongholds. So while tribal identity was grounded in place and in blood, it was shaped day to day by deals made between the feasting table, marriages arranged, and the sacred groves and battles fought in the various locations across Britain. By the time the Romans had established its province in the south, the tribal Britain nature was already transforming. Some leaders cooperated, others rebelled. Boudica, of course, the queen of the Iceni, became a legend after her failed uprising in 60 CE. Tacitus paints her as a tragic heroine driven by justice and vengeance. Of course, not all Romans looked at her quite like that. But the tribes, of course, didn't vanish. Many adapted and became part of the Romano-British world. Their names would live on in the lands like Kent, which comes from the Canti, Devon, which comes from the Demoni, and more archaeological digs are still unearthing the stories, the tools, the homes, the jewelry, and even ancient roads that predate the Roman grid system that we have seen today. Their world was one of warriors, farmers, traders, and artisans bound together by ancient ancestry and place. The earth, of course, has some of these secrets, and we're just learning to understand it, and thankfully, we are coming to understand it. And with that, I'd like to thank you today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to me at any of my social media sites, usually at Welsh History Pod, or specifically on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you'd like to help the podcast in a way, you can do so through donating through Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you, whether you're watching or listening. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.